haven't already got yourself a drink, now will be the time to grab one. We're going to get going in a couple of minutes. So get some refreshments and get yourself ready.
Like you, there is no other. True delight is found in you alone. Your grace, a well too deep to fathom. Your love exceeds the heavens' reach. Your truth, a fount of perfect wisdom, my highest good and my unending need. Oh, oh Lord, my rock and my redeemer, strong defender of my weary heart, my sword to fight the cruel deceiver, and my shield against his hateful darts, my song when enemies surround me, my hope when tides of sorrow rise, my joy when trials are abounding, your faithfulness, my refuge in the night. Oh Lord, my rock and my redeemer, gracious Savior of my ruined life, my guilt and cross laid on your shoulders, in my place you suffered, bled, and died. You rose, the grave and death are conquered. You broke my bonds of sin and shame. You rose, the grave and death are conquered.
Good evening. If I can break into your conversations there. It's lovely to have to do that. A very warm welcome to our 6:30 not evening service at Beckles Baptist Church. We're doing something a bit different today. This is the first of our 3 life events, in case you're wondering, what am I doing here? It's great to have you, especially if you're visiting for the first time, or you've come along with a friend, or you picked up a flyer on the market stall. Well done for coming. I find it strange as a Christian going to another church building. So the fact that you came through the door is great. My name is Peter Skerritt. I serve here as the associate pastor at this church. Our pastor, Tom Fenning, is not able to be here. He'd love to be. He'll be itching his feet at home because he wants to be here. He caught COVID last week, and hopefully he'll be back in action again soon. In a bit, I'll be joined by Tamar Pollard up on the stage. And Tamar, we're looking forward to hearing all you've got to share with us tonight. Thank you. Just a couple of practical things so you know what's going on, especially if you're new here. If you're thinking, where are the toilets? Where are the facilities? Well, the signs do tell you. But honestly, don't worry during the service if you think, I actually need to get up and I need to walk. No one's going to think anything of you. Just feel free. Refreshments, hopefully you've already grabbed some before. They're going to stay out there. And then at the end of the service, our time together, it's not really ended. Really, it's just time to grab some more refreshments, stay around, talk with each other, and Tamar will be hanging around, not till midnight, but she does need to get back. But she'd love to talk with people, particularly about what's being raised. Just to flag up, we won't be having a formal time of Q&A, but you can have your own time with her, asking her questions after. And again, if you've come with a friend, just why not think throughout this time as Tamar talks, what questions do I have? Who could I ask a friend that I've come with as well? Tamar, do come on up, flick the mic on, and we'll grab a seat. We don't normally do it this kind of Michael Parkinson style.
As long as you haven't got a red book on
Yeah, well, I was
life.
just thinking,
Yeah. I don't want any big secrets
this is your
revealing.
life, is that right? Yeah. Didn't Tom tell you about that? No. Okay. You've come not too far today. You've come from Bedford.
That's right, yeah.
Do you want to just tell people what you do there?
Yeah, so I work for a church. I work with children and young people and their families, so stuff in the community and also stuff within the church itself.
Okay, so you were this morning at like 9 o'clock. What were you doing?
9 o'clock, I was probably running around, getting mic'd up, making sure the different children's groups were good to go, and then kids' talks and children's groups this morning.
Cool. And you haven't always been a church worker? What did you do?
No,
before?
so I'm a teacher by training, a primary school teacher, and taught in Derbyshire for 5 years.
We were having a conversation at dinner about which is the best age group to teach at primary school.
Year 5,
you
for
think
sure.
Year 5?
So only year 5, are you year 5? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, in fact, yeah.
Thought
Are
I
you in
had
my
a
wife's
friend.
class? Are you in? Yeah, you are. Yeah. She's one of the good people, I'm sure. Yeah. I did a bit of research. I hope you won't mind.
Oh, no.
Tamar's on the internet. Tamar, you work for your church and you tell people that you are a cricket fanatic, a chocoholic.
I don't want to talk about cricket
Well,
today.
yeah.
Anyone who's followed the cricket, let's leave it
Well,
right
that's good,
there.
'cause I don't want to talk about cricket either. I don't know anything about it. Chocoholic, travel mad, fan of Scandinavian crime thrillers.
Yeah.
I don't know very much about cricket. I know even less about Scandinavian crime thrillers. I do know a bit about chocolate.
Yeah, Lindor for the
Oh.
absolute.
Wow. You've pitched it high there.
You've got to.
Yeah, no, I think my wife would agree. Travel mad, just tell us maybe one of your most significant travel memories.
I mean, my mum was from New Zealand, so if I didn't say New Zealand, I would, that wouldn't go down too well. But I think, as we talk about my upbringing, I love just going to slightly off-piste places. So, Mongolia or Cuba, that kind of thing, as well as the ordinary.
Mongolia, that's interesting. My little boy is 5 years old, and he's discovered Mongolia on the map, and he likes to kind of mix words up and try and get us to guess what country they are. It's always Mongolia at the moment.
There you go. Yeah, no, that's probably the most unusual place.
Okay.
But a lot of my travel has been linked in with travelling through Europe.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're going to hear about that a bit
Yeah.
later. You're also a Yorkshire lass, Yorkshire born, Yorkshire bred,
Oh, sorry, can we hit the mic? That was like fun from the heart.
Yeah.
Yes.
strong in arm.
Yeah, not thick in head.
No, thank
well,
you, yeah.
actually, I've just hit the mic, so maybe I am.
I'm allowed to say this because my wife's from Yorkshire as well. So, great to have you with us. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about life, like family life growing up? Yeah, I presume it was in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in West Yorkshire. I kind of followed in the footsteps of my parents and I think grandparents as well in teaching. So my parents were both teachers. They met teaching, so Mum had come over from New Zealand on a working holiday, thinking England was all cobble streets and thatched cottages, and landed in London and had a bit of a surprise. But she moved up to West Yorkshire to work in a school, and that's where she met Dad. It took a bit of time, but eventually they got married and we came along. So sort of grew up on the outskirts of Leeds and Bradford. And in some ways it was quite ordinary. Dad was sports mad, so my love of cricket and rugby league comes from him. My love of rugby union comes from my mum as an All Blacks fan. And love of travel comes from them as well, really. So standard in some ways and yet quite different upbringing in other ways.
Yeah. Mum and Dad, names? Otherwise, I don't want to keep calling them Mum and Dad. But
So my dad was Michael and my mum was Jo. And then I've got an older sister called Rebecca and a younger brother called Andrew. And I don't know what I did to get the weird name, but somehow, out of all those normal names, I landed Tamar.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't going to say it, but you've said it now. It was a lot. It was a lot easier to find your bio on the internet.
I know.
So Tamar Pollard. There aren't many of them. So,
Yeah,
it's
we're a
great.
rare breed.
Yeah. You said slightly unusual upbringing. In what ways?
Why? So mum and dad, actually shortly before they were married, they were on a trip with a load of colleagues, youth hosteling in Prague in 1968. And it's on the GCSE syllabus for some, so it might ring a bell with those of you younger, or those of you older may remember that in 1968 there was what we call the Prague Spring, where there was a sort of uprising against the communist regime. And mum and dad happened to be there, just on a youth hosteling holiday. And dad was reading in the Bible that morning in his bunk bed, a bit towards the end of the Bible, in a book called 1 John, where it talks about if we see people in need and out of compassion don't help them, how can we say we love God? And the next thing he knows is banging on the door saying, the Russians have arrived. And they looked out and the tanks were rolling through the street. I mean, we can imagine that, can't we? Because we're hit with those images too much at the moment. But the tanks were rolling through and flags were being burnt and shots were being fired. And mum and dad were there for about 36 hours and then evacuated. But unsurprisingly, they couldn't get the images out of their head and what they had read and kept talking about, what do we do with this? We've just seen people in need. We've seen a sort of oppressive regime. We've seen people in fear. We've seen poverty. How do we show God's love?
Was that the first time that they'd become aware of that?
Yeah, I guess they must have known a little bit. Well, mum, I don't know how much mum would have known, actually. She'd been in the country a couple of years.
Yeah,
so.
I was just going to say, because, I mean, particularly for the younger guys, it's kind of hard. Russian-Ukraine situation aside, for a long time, Eastern Europe has felt just like any other normal place.
Yeah.
And did you want to just fill in a little bit about why that was?
Oh my goodness, this is my degree put into practice. So after the Second World War,
Degrees have some use. Good, yeah.
and Germany got split. I suppose it was East and West, so we split almost Europe in half, to put it very simply. And the Soviet Union, which Russia was a large part of, were the dominant force over Eastern and Central Europe. So countries like Romania, countries like Hungary, countries like Poland, they ruled over, and they had communist governments in power. They were kind of a buffer zone for the Soviet Union, but also political puppets for them. And quite a difficult place to be. Food rations were common, and people lived in fear of if they were seen to be disloyal, and Christians were not, well, they weren't allowed to be Christians, they were persecuted. So that was sort of, mum and dad got glimpses of that, but not for long. And then shortly after, they were at somebody's house, and they happened to meet a Dutchman called Andrew, guy some people call Brother Andrew, who works for a Christian organisation called Open Doors. And they were talking to him, and they were saying about what they'd seen and what they'd read, and what should they do with it. And Brother Andrew was already going in his VW Beetle, smuggling in Bibles to Eastern Europe, because of course it was banned literature. And he just said, well, look, you're teachers. You've got ridiculously long holidays. I can say that as an ex-teacher. I don't have them anymore.
No.
But you have long holidays. Why don't you use those holidays and just go as tourists and go and help people? And so that was the start of 30 years of going in, taking in humanitarian aid, so foods and medicine and clothes, and smuggling in Bibles. And so as we came along as kids, we went with them. So my first trip, I was 7 months old. My sister was older than me. She slept in a hammock across Vesco to Car that we drove at that time. But we had a camper van by the time I went. And yeah, so that's what I mean by it. It's a bit unusual and love of travel because, yeah.
Some slightly unusual summer holidays then.
Yeah,
Okay.
not the standard summer.
Yeah. Your parents were obviously committed Christians at that point. If they're thinking there's a need, we should go to Eastern Europe. What about you as a child?
Yeah, so I think right from the get-go, Mum and Dad taught me the Bible, told me about Jesus. They prayed with me. They took me along to church. And it was when I was 6, I was at an event where I think I grasped, for the first time really, that I had done wrong. I knew that. I didn't. That probably wasn't the first time I got that bit. But I knew I'd done wrong, and I knew that I deserved punishment. I was aware of a punishment at home, but I knew I'd gone against God, and I deserved punishment by Him. But I also knew that Jesus had died in my place to take that punishment. And so at 6, on the bottom bunk bed,
the camper van?
No, that was at home, actually at home. And just prayed a prayer, just saying, sorry for the wrong I'd done, and asking God to forgive me and for Jesus to be my rescuer and friend. So quite a young age, it'd become a reality. Sort of a start, I guess. It's never the end, is it? But the start of a sort of my own faith journey.
Okay. So you obviously you sensed what your parents were doing. You understood that. How did you actually find it going on these journeys each summer?
Yeah, I didn't love it. I mean, I really didn't love it. It was hot. I was stuck in a camper van with just my brother and sister to play with and talk to for 6 weeks. Not fun. The food was different, you know. A lot of us don't like unusual food, do we? And it was quite unusual in my head. The toilets were pretty grim.
If there were toilets.
If there were toilets, yeah, exactly. I used to have a photo book called Beds I've Slept In and Toilets I've Used. But my parents hated it, so I did get rid of it in the end. But I used to delight in taking pictures. But yeah, it wasn't typical either. I didn't like the fact my friends were just starting to go on package holidays and would come back and talk about going to the beach in Spain and be able to bring sweets for the class from Portugal. And I was stuck in this camper van, and we just travelled. We would do, 6, 7, 8,000 miles in 6 weeks. And actually, when we were out and about, you weren't allowed to speak in the street, because if you did, the secret police might see you and they might follow you. And
because you were English.
Because we were English. Yeah. And that could lead to friends being put in prison. Yeah. So you had that sense of fear, as well as it being not very luxurious.
Yeah. Would you say they were still quite significant times for you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So even though I didn't love it, actually, I think they were times where that sort of fledgling faith I had in God grew. So there's one situation when I was 7, and we were going, what is now Kosovo. It was Yugoslavia at the time. And we had a friend who worked for a church, needed medical help, but he wasn't granted permission by the authorities to travel to the city because he worked for a church. That's the kind of way they sort of control people. And I remember the hushed conversation going on with Mum and Dad at night, and them saying, we just need to get him to a hospital. We'll take him in our vehicle. But they didn't want to leave his wife and his 4 kids, because what if the police realised he had gone, and what would happen to them? So the next day, we squeezed another 6 into the camper van, and off we set to the city, and we were stopped by police. And they asked to see our passports, and they checked off my family. They got into the back and walked around, and they walked as close as we are, and they didn't see the guy, and they didn't see his wife, and they didn't see any of his kids. And my mum's hand was just firmly on my knee to be quiet, because I'm vegan. And as we drove off, I was like, how on earth did that happen? And my mum, I remember the phrase Mum used. She went, we can't explain it all, but we see in the Bible Jesus making blind eyes see. He's just done the opposite. And so that was significant, going, I can't explain this other than God's at work and he was with us. And similarly, a year later, we were going from Hungary to Romania, and they found 60, 70 Bibles on the border of Romania. Now, Romania was one of the harshest of all the regimes. Leader was called Ceausescu. And when they found the Bibles, they said we had to pay a fine. It was about £3,500 then, but that was 1985, so it would be tens of thousands now. And we didn't have the money. And they said that they would keep my mum. So my mum was on a New Zealand passport, we were on my dad's passport, British. So they decided to keep my mum hostage and the camper van hostage. Wow. And they marched us with Kalashnikovs at our back.
How old were you?
I was 8. It was like I was Famous Five mad, so it was like a Famous Five adventure. But we were marched back to the nearest town in Hungary, so we had guns at our backs for 2 hours. My little brother was 6, so he was in tears at the time. I can't remember what my sister did, but we just walked. And then when we got to town, we then got a bus to someone we knew, and Dad had to spend the next 2 days phoning through to the UK to try and get a loan from a bank, but it was a weekend. But they held an emergency meeting, and it just so happened that Dad taught 3 of their members of staff's kids, so they all said they'd act as guarantors, and so the money was wired across in 3 days, and we got Mum back. But Mum and Dad said, don't tell people how much we paid. They were always very much, before a border crossing, would pray with us as a family, would pray together, entrusting ourselves to God, almost saying, we'd love to get through smoothly, but if we don't, help us to trust that you are good and you'll provide for us and protect us. And so they said, look, we've prayed that. God will take care of this. And I guess as a kid, you don't really, one, I didn't get the seriousness of it, but also, and you don't get the value of how much money that was, or what a loan is even, but they just don't worry about it. So we didn't worry about it. But then for anonymous gifts and donations, just coming through the post or through the letterbox, the loan was paid off with 6 months to the date. And again, that was hugely significant for me, going, God isn't just big and out there, but he's interested in the little details of our life. He cares about us as individuals. And so whilst I didn't get how serious it was, I could see that he had taken care of us. So yeah, I think I didn't love it, but it was a really helpful time as well.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty spectacular. Now, it's one of those particular summer trips that we're really here tonight to talk about.
Yeah.
Was it summer 1997?
Yeah.
It was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to just tell us a bit about what happened on that particular trip?
Yeah, so so communism fell really. The Berlin Wall came down 1989. Romanian Ceausescu shot on Christmas Day in 1989. And all the other countries around Central Eastern Europe, one by one, their regimes were toppled, these communist regimes. But there was still immense poverty and a great need. And so Mum and Dad thought, we're going to still go in. We're going to still keep taking aid and helping equip churches and love people. And so they kept going. But as we hit sort of year 12 in school, sixth form, we were allowed to stop if we put our summer to good use. We weren't allowed to just spend 6 weeks in bed. But if we could say our plan, we didn't have to go. And so it was 97, and Mum and Dad actually were just on their own that year. One by one we had stopped. And they were again travelling from Hungary to Romania and on to Ukraine, when They liked to do the border crossings at night because there were fewer in the queue. And so they were travelling overnight and the lights failed on the camper van. And the roads were not lit and not surfaced. And so they just thought, you know what, we'll just pull into a lay-by. It's not safe to drive. And we'll just go tomorrow. And that was often how our trips rolled. They were very fluid. You'd have a plan, but there's quite a bit of flex in them. So they pulled into the lay-by. But whilst they were in the lay-by, some local youths spotted a British vehicle, and I guess they got greedy, thinking this is a way of getting a bit of cash. And so they knocked on the door, and they told my parents they were police, and they said to my parents they were illegally parked, and they had to pay a fine. Now this time the fine was only £14 equivalent, so Mum and Dad were like, we don't believe the police, but do you know what, we'll pay it, and in the morning when we go and get the lights fixed on the camper van, we'll just report a gangs operating on the road.
Was that kind of thing had happened before to them or other friends? People kind of spotting a Western target?
We'd often stop in lay-bys if you could in countries. I remember one time in the middle of the night, Dad was trying to listen to cricket scores on World Service, and the van started shaking. Mum was like, there's someone climbing on the roof, because we always had stuff stored on top as well. And she grabbed the table legs for, you know, like on caravans you have those screwing tables. So she gave my dad two. She had two. She's like, come on, Michael. He's like, and he left her because he was just listening to the cricket while she was chasing this guy down through the cornfields. So, yeah.
Fairly standard.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a bit of corruption with police and things like that. So we hadn't had loads of grief over the years. We'd always been safe, but it wasn't unusual to be disturbed. And so Mum and Dad didn't leave the lay-by. They just thought, well, we've paid the fine, we'll stay here and we'll deal with it.
That wasn't the last time they saw the youth, so.
Exactly. So I think the guys had seen it. It was 10 days into the trip. The camper van would have been rammed, and they decided to return. And so Mum and Dad were woken with another banging, and my dad had had enough. And so he climbed into the cab to drive off. But they'd come back armed, and one of them had an iron bar, and so he smashed through the driver's window and started beating my dad, and beat him till he died. And then they fled the scene.
Your mum at the time?
Mum, at that moment, tried to resuscitate Dad, couldn't. She couldn't drive the vehicle because he was a dead weight in the seat. And so she got dressed and she hid passports and wedding rings, and the guys had given a receipt, so she hid that too, and money. She knew a real peace, I think, and just read the Bible and prayed. She knew they would be back because she'd seen them. And so she was a witness that needed to be dealt with, but there was nowhere to go and nothing she could do. And so she just waited, and they did return, and they came back to kill her. So they beat her and strangled her. But they just left her unconscious. They didn't actually succeed.
I mean, yeah, frightful in itself, in that your mum having to watch that and then have to to sit and wait. You spoke of peace.
Yeah, well, that's how she had talked about it afterwards. She talked about a peace that God was with her, and a real clarity of mind, I guess. I mean, you can't imagine being able to do that, can you, when you've just seen your husband murdered in front of you, to have that sort of...
the wherewithal, she hid things prepared and sat and
just sat there. And she sat with a fly spray, because that's what she was looking around going, obviously she couldn't find the table legs that time. No, but she had the fly spray, and it's just once they came in, because they just burst in that time, battered the door down, she tried to spray that at them, but she couldn't take on 3 guys.
Yeah. So you weren't there. How did you hear about all of this?
Yeah, so my mum was found the next morning, which was Tuesday morning, and taken to hospital. But she was pretty touch and go for a while. And so it took them time to get information out of her. And her jaw had been shattered. There was only one doctor who spoke English in the hospital. You know, a whole load of things delayed us finding out. But on the Wednesday morning, the news broke actually on Sky News before any of us had been told.
Did you pick that up?
No,
before? No.
Fortunately. But family friends did, but we didn't. And then my sister was in work, so a policeman came to her work. I guess she was found through the electoral or something. So she was located first. Then my brother was woken up by the Daily Mail phoning. But wonderfully, I guess, as the Daily Mail were establishing it was Michael and Joe's home, the doorbell went, and it was a policeman who was a Christian, who was friends with my dad. In fact, his wife was my mum's classroom assistant.
Oh, wow.
And his daughter was in the same class as my brother at school. So Sam arrived and broke the news to my brother, rather than the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
But my brother and sister didn't know where I was. So I was off doing working with kids and teenagers on the beach in Broadstairs. And but they didn't know that. They knew I was doing something somewhere, but they didn't know. Which is why, in a way, it was good it was on Sky News, because somebody who saw the Sky News knew where I was and was able to contact the Foreign Office. And so I was actually called up from the beach, but didn't know why. And thought I was like, what have I done wrong? Like, to be pulled off from doing kids' work. In my head, I was like, I don't think I've done anything. I was just a leader of the team I was working with, and I was trying to get it, and he wasn't saying much. And then I walked into the building where we were staying, and there was a policeman. I was like, what have I done wrong? And when he took off his helmet, I was like, oh. And he proceeded to tell me about Mum initially. And I think I worked out then that Dad was dead, because he just kept talking about, your mum's been in intensive care and this and that, but we think she's going to be okay. I'm like, you're not saying anything about Dad. And it was almost like this out-of-body experience. It did feel, I think it was shock. It felt like I was watching on. And so I knew it was true what they were saying, but quite disconnected from it.
Yeah. At that point, were you shocked, disconnected? Did it hit you then, or not really?
No, it didn't hit me. I then travelled across to Heathrow. My brother and sister flew down from Yorkshire. And we got onto the plane. And as we got onto the plane, we were given copies of a London Evening Standard, and it was headline. And I remember we were upgraded to business class. It was like amazing, the only time I've ever travelled that. But I remember just wanting to run down the plane going, how can you just sit there with your drink and your newspaper? This is my mum and dad. But I still hadn't cried. It was just really surreal to see it reported on. I think my brother and sister had been chased by journalists, but that was my only exposure to the media at that point. And we arrived sort of late on a Wednesday night into Hungary, into Budapest, but it was too late to go to the northeast of the country, so we had to stay, and then the consulate took us the next day. And I still don't, I didn't sleep that night, so I guess there was a reality, but I don't, how can you take it all in? I don't think really until I got to the hospital.
Yeah. So you were waiting Wednesday night, Thursday morning, you're taken to the hospital to see your mum. What was that like? How do you put words to that?
Yeah.
What was that like?
So, as we pulled up, we got news that they'd just caught the three lads. So before we saw Mum, we knew their ages. They'd been caught because the receipt they'd given actually happened to be a speeding ticket from one of them, and Mum had hidden that. So they'd been found. So I think you walk in fuming, like, so I was 20, my brother's 18, and one of the lads, actually the one who, I later found out, who beat Dad to death was 18 years, a week younger than my brother. So knowing it wasn't abstract, there were actual people I could pin it on. So I walked into the hospital with that, and then as we opened the door where my mum was, she was speaking, but she didn't sound like my mum because her jaw was shattered and hadn't been able to be operated on that point. Her voice was quite different. And then as we got into the room, she didn't look like my mum either, because she was so battered and bruised and marks, and I think like you see in TV when someone's beaten up, but I never seen that. And so I walked in, and she didn't sound like her, and she didn't look like her. And I had I knew who had done this. And then she was talking at length. She was on the phone to Yorkshire Television. They'd phoned up, and the doctor who spoke English wasn't on duty, and so I think these nurses were like, oh, just threw the phone at her. And so she was speaking live on the news, evening news, and went into great detail, horrific detail about what had happened. And they just let it roll. And
Was that the first time you were hearing that
yeah,
information?
so I'd got sketchy details from the Foreign Office, but they were still piecing it all together. The penny dropped. It was horrendous to see and hear and know. It was like this crashing weight, I guess, of emotion and it's anger. I think hatred probably. I think if those guys had been brought in front of me at that moment, I probably couldn't have taken them on, but I would have tried my best. I was so angry. My dad was a real gentle, quiet, unassuming sort of guy. Lots of quirks and lots of, he wasn't perfect, but his manner was so kind and compassionate. And to hear how he went was just awful. And that my mum had had to see it and see her, I guess, show him what she had been through. So we just stood there listening. And then at the end of that, towards the end of the sort of interview, although it wasn't really an interview, at the end of a monologue, she just said, I don't bear any malice, but I forgive them. And if there's any Christians watching this, can you pray they don't just know my forgiveness, but also God's forgiveness? I think the emotions probably went up a notch or two at that point. Like, it wasn't just angry with the lads then. It was angry at my mum, actually. Yeah. Like, how could she say that when she'd almost died and Dad had died? Yeah. And I think anger at God really as well, that he had let it happen. So I stormed out.
And I mean, your mum's response there was quite phenomenal. Like, that she is on the phone for one thing, talking about it, and then talking of forgiveness. I think I'm right in saying that basically characterised the whole way that she dealt with everything from then on. Do you want to tell us? I mean, she got quite some exposure. Quite famous, wasn't she?
Well, I mean,
Awards.
So, she got a bravery award from the Queen, and Tony Blair was Prime Minister at the time, and a Courage Award from him. And I mean, it was interesting because she sank back. in her bed, and later when talking about it, she said, I mean, she had been in and out of consciousness for, well, we've like over 48 hours.
Yeah.
And so she said she hadn't thought about it beforehand, and the words just came out. And then she sort of sank back in bed, and I'd stormed off. I don't know what Andrew and Rebecca were doing. But she just thought, do I mean that? Or have I just said that? And she's like, no, I do. And I think she felt God had almost put those words and that ability to forgive in her, and so she should use it. And so, it took off because it's so countercultural, isn't it? I mean, even more now with our cancel culture, to say you forgive. And so even like flying back, we had to have a press conference at the airport, and then they gave us a day of peace, so my brother could get his A-level results without press coverage. But then it was national news for a few weeks, and then in the trial, but locally it was big for a long time. She was known as that woman when she went into the local market town, because everyone knew her face.
Woman.
Yeah,
Okay.
that woman.
Yeah. So she talked, she said naturally it came out not holding malice against these young men after all that she'd seen them do, all that they'd done to her. How did that carry on? Because it didn't just stop there in the hospital with those words.
Yeah, so she had to go back for the trial, obviously, and she wanted to show her forgiveness in action. So she asked the judge if she could speak to them, and she was able to look each of them in the eye and say she forgives, which I think is another step on almost. But she had the strength to do that, and she gave each of them a care package for prison. So stationery and sweets and biscuits and toiletries and a Bible for each of them. And she asked to keep in touch, and 2 of the 3 said yes. And so she wrote to them, and then on the first anniversary, the mayor of the town, it's called Nirchaza, where my dad was killed, had a memorial erected in the lay-by, almost as a thank you to my parents for their years of service to Hungary and beyond. And so she went back for that unveiling and visited them in hospital, in prison, visited them in prison. And then she went back again with Channel 4. I never remember, because 2 talked to her, I can't remember if it was Cutting Edge or Dispatches, but anyway, she went back a further time. So she visited them and kept writing. And she also kept going into Eastern Europe, not on her own, but with other organisations.
So there was one chap, the youngest one,
Yeah.
18 years old.
Yeah, the
His
one
name-
who beat Dad to
Yeah.
death. Yeah, Istvan.
There's quite a remarkable story with him, isn't there?
Yeah, so Mum, 2 or 3 years later, developed Alzheimer's, early onset. And it was sort of in her early stages of Alzheimer's, she received a letter. So Attila had gradually stopped writing, but Istvan kept writing. I'll say he's the one who actually killed Dad. And she got a letter from him saying, I caused death, but through it I found life. And he wrote about how he couldn't get over this lady who he had tried to kill, whose husband he had killed, how she could say she forgave. And she kept harping on about God, so he was like, well, I better read this book she's given me. And so he had read Mark's Gospel, an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. And he had become convinced himself that Jesus had lived, was a real person of history, but more than that was the perfect Son of God who lived and died a horrific death, worse than my dad, but come back to life. And he'd done that to take the punishment for the wrong we do, so that we can know forgiveness and life forever. And Istvan, in his prison cell, became a Christian. That prayer was answered. He found God's forgiveness.
I mean, listening to that, I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
I imagine that some people might be at that point thinking, though, hang on, it's a bit of a sideline, but is that really fair? I mean, after all that he's done.
And yeah, I guess it's easy, isn't it? Because we often do that, don't we? We often put ourselves a bit on a ladder and compare ourselves, and we'll go, well, I know I'm not like really, really good, but I'm not like that person. And we judge each other we judge ourselves by each other's standards, don't we? But if we're honest, we all say and think and do wrong. We are by nature selfish, and that damages relationships, and it damages our relationship with God. And so, in a way, none of us deserve God's forgiveness, whether we're Istvan or we're sat in Beccles in 2022. None of us deserve it. We deserve God's punishment. But God doesn't judge us by that standard. He knows exactly what we're like, the stuff we keep hidden and the stuff that's out there. But he offers us a chance to be forgiven and have Jesus' perfection, which is mind-blowing. But that's what he offers. And so I don't deserve God's forgiveness, but I got it at age 6. My mum didn't deserve it, but she received it at age 14. Dad at 30, and Istvan as a 20-something in Hungary. None of us deserved it, but it's a free gift.
Good, thank you. If it's okay, we'll just circle back.
Yeah.
Because your mum's response was, I think we'll agree, astonishing. But at the same time, I suspect for you, you even said it, that kind of heightened your feelings of rage at the time.
Yeah.
You talked about feeling anger, hatred towards them and towards God. How did you, particularly talking about God in that situation, how do you reconcile what happened? There must have been some anger, some questioning, like why?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think in the moment, I stormed off and stood on the balcony of the hospital, gripping the rail, and asked some pretty big questions, really. Beginning with, do I even think God exists? Because this has happened, surely it shouldn't. And just found myself going, why do I think I was 20, why over the last 20 years, or 14 from being 6, why am I convinced that God exists? And I found myself going, well, I've seen it in the money coming through for the fine. I've seen it with the police not seeing the people in the camper van. But I've also seen it in just lots of little ways, God providing and taking care. I've seen it through the pages of the Bible. I've seen it in other people's lives, both in the UK and in Eastern Europe. So I couldn't deny that God exists. I see it in the beauty of creation. I grew up on the edge of the moors, and it was stunning in the Yorkshire Dales, and going, yeah, I believe that there is a powerful creator God. So then my next question was, well, do I believe he's loving? Because it's one thing to have a powerful creator God, but he could just be ruling on high. And again, I think it was through looking through, going back and sort of, why have I been convinced of it all these years? Well, it's because I've seen how he's taken care of me. I've seen how he's loved my family. I've read of his provision for others, both in the Bible and in biographies. And I believe he is good and loving. And sort of, this is quick, but it was that sort of working through, why? Can I really say this is true? And then, well, what do I think of the person of Jesus? Well, I believe he's his son, and I believe that he did live and die and rise again, so that I may know God's forgiveness, undeserved as it is. And so working through those things made me go, well, what do I do with that?
Yeah, yeah.
And I knew that we're told we're forgiven and we should forgive much. I know that we're told to love our enemies. I knew that, but that's there.
What
And
was
this
it?
heart was not there.
C.S. Lewis, what did he say?
C.S. Lewis says that we all think forgiveness is a lovely idea until we have to do it ourselves. And it was that moment of going, I can't do this, God. And almost saying to him, it's too much. Like, I was so angry. And I can't just flick a switch and be all peaceful and lovely. And I don't want to forgive. I want revenge. And I know you've said this, but I can't change my emotions. I can't muster something up no matter how hard I try. Yeah. And almost just saying to, I mean, it's all going on, this internal battle, I think. I don't think I was saying it out loud. But I did say, like, prayed, look, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to do it in me. You're going to have to change me and give me the strength. And remarkably, God did. Now, I'm not, like, since then, I've had loads of, come on to this, struggles with forgiveness other times. It's not always been that instant. But for whatever reason, maybe because I did throw myself on God's mercy and didn't hold on to anything. It was almost like, here's my mess. Yeah, God answered. So I was able to go back and hug my mum and say to her, I'm with you on this. Yeah. That didn't take away the pain and the heartache, but it did take away the anger and the desire for revenge.
Great. So that was all processing on the balcony before you walked back in.
Yeah.
Something you just said would maybe helpful just to clarify. We've been talking about forgiveness all of tonight. Do you want to just help us with what you mean by that, or what we don't mean by forgiving?
Yeah, well, I think, like, we often say forgive and forget. We don't forget, do we? So I don't think it's that. I think it's a costly choice, forgiveness is, a costly choice to let go rather than harbouring the bitterness, rather than wanting revenge. It's actually a costly choice not just to let go, but to choose to love. And I really struggled with that. Like, you'd think with Dad's death, that would be the hardest time. And the grief that went with it was hideous. And I, you know, obviously I wish Dad was still alive. But I think other times I've struggled when people have wronged me. Maybe people I know, well, definitely people I know, and you feel hurt and disappointed, and you want to be vindicated, and you want them to know the damage they've done. And I found it almost a daily process then, forgiving, and there's times I've not wanted to again, and maybe I've given it over to God and then snatched it back and dwelt on it, rather than that costly choice to go, no, I'm giving it to you, God, and I'm trusting you to give me what I need to love and go forward, not harbour bitterness. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Does that answer?
absolutely. Yeah. You've talked a lot about how...
I've talked a lot. That's
why you're here, Tamar.
Have cake afterwards.
Lots of cake. God has obviously played a massive role in how, even just how you've explained what it means to forgive right now, which does somewhat beg the question, and it's a big question, isn't it? Well, I'm going to tell you what it is. She's waiting. Can you forgive if you don't have faith? You've shown us that having faith leads you to forgive. Can you forgive if you don't?
Yeah. I mean, that's hard, isn't it? Because my situation was, I forgave in the context of, one, knowing how much I've been forgiven undeservedly, and two, trusting in God's strength. to give me the ability to forgive. I don't believe I could have done that on my own. I have read of stories where people from different faiths or no faith have forgiven, so I can't say you can't, but I don't think I could have done. It was so huge, and I'm so broken myself. I don't think I could have. Well, you can't manipulate your emotions, so I don't think I could have done it without God's enabling.
Yeah, and I think that's been very clear as you've talked. Just a couple more questions. Firstly, I think I'm right in saying that you've not managed to keep contact with the young men who did this.
Yeah, so we kept in touch for a while, but then as Mum's Alzheimer's kicked in, things disappeared, like addresses and all sorts of others. And so we lost contact with them. I did try, so I went over for the 20th anniversary, so 5 years this August. Well, yeah, it would be 25 years in August, but I went, you know what I mean, 5 years ago. I managed to locate it through searching on Google Earth, having watched a film about someone doing that in India. I was like, I can do this. So I went over, and I wanted to try and see the guys for myself, hear what they're doing. They'll all be out of prison now. See if Istvan is still going on and all that. But turns out their names are quite common. And you can't really send someone a Facebook message request and go, oh, by the way, did you kill my dad? And yeah, photos, well, it was 25 years ago. You know, we all look different. And so no, I haven't managed to track them down. Yeah. Hopefully one day I'll see them when I'm with Jesus.
What would you say to them?
Well, yeah, I guess I'd like to, I wanted to say, echo Mum's forgiveness. And I guess Istvan's my brother in Jesus. Now, we're told when we get God's forgiveness, we join his family. And so, yeah, I'd love to, say that and just learn more a bit about them.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely to hear from you. I've got one more question for you. We're going to get our money's worth. No. Tamar, I just wanted to take the opportunity now to speak, as we close, to two different types of people who might be here. People who will be struggling to forgive themselves, and people who are struggling to forgive someone else. What would you say to them? And then we'll close.
Those who are struggling to forgive others, it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard. I guess if we've got a desire to forgive others, that's something we've got to ask, because sometimes we don't want to. But if we've got a desire, then it's going back to that. It's a costly choice. It's a daily costly choice. You don't have to do it alone. And you don't have to do it alone because God loves to give the resources you need, but you don't have to do it alone. Other people get it. I think sometimes we're reluctant to share our burdens, and often when there's a need for forgiveness, there's a story that needs to be told, and people to walk with you and understand your sadness and sort of cry with you as you cry, and pray with you as you try, and love you through the ups and downs, and encourage you through the daily choice. And those who are struggling to forgive themselves, I guess, again, we carry a whole lot of shame, don't we? But we're told that God loves us with an immeasurable, unbreakable, forever love. And so it's rejoicing in that. And we were thinking this morning in church about the fact he sees us as precious. He wants us to be his treasured possession. And so we go to him with our brokenness and our failings, and we've all got them and the shame. And he loves to give us his forgiveness. He loves for things to be held up in the light and then cover it with, I guess, with his son's blood, and it's dealt with. We don't need to cling to our shame or our blame or our guilt or regrets. We can go and know that it's paid in full, and we can know forgiveness forever and friendship with him.
Amen. Thank you, Tamar.
No worries.
Tamar's going to be staying around. To stay there for now. Unless you want to go sit down.
I'll stay here.
No, you can go sit down, Tamar. It's fine. We'll prep you later. Tamar's going to be staying around for coffee, refreshments. Do seek her out. Come and speak to a Christian friend if you've got other questions you want to talk about more. There's a few other ways that you can kind of follow up what we've been talking about today. Tamar's just really helped us today think about that first topic of life, one story about forgiveness. The next 2 weeks, hopefully you've got a flyer here, we're talking about other real difficult challenges. Depression. Next Sunday, Matthew Price from Galston is going to come and speak to us. And then the week after that, Roger Prime, a former pastor of this church, will be talking about tragedy and bereavement in his own life. So do make sure that you're here for the next couple of weeks, online and in person. But that's one way you can just follow up a bit more. Also on your way out, just to flag up these things, they'll be on the tables on your way out. This white little booklet is free. This black booklet is free. The white booklet is really just a big accessible copy of John's Gospel. Tamar has shown us what life to the full looks like, even in the pain of life when it hits. Pick it up. It's yours to read. Jesus, this is written that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Have a read of it. And this also talks about life that lasts. When you feel empty, you need quenching. What do? This is free. Take it away as well. We'd love to give you them. We'd also love to see you on a Sunday. You'd be very welcome any Sunday morning or evening, 9:15, 11:15, and at 6:30 as well. I'm going to close our time in prayer now before we carry on with refreshments. Don't feel any need to rush off. We're going to bow our heads in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for your kindness to us tonight as we've gathered. We want to start by thanking you for the life of Tamar's parents. Thank you for their service, their love for you, their fruitfulness for you. Thank you for their sacrifice for you. And we want to lament their death. Father, how brutal and wicked that murder was, how sad how the passing away through Alzheimer's is, as we see life once strong and fit taken away. We thank you so much for your kindness to Tamar in bringing her to a place of forgiveness and freedom and even fruitfulness where she is now. We pray for her, particularly now as she travels back later tonight, that you might grant her peace, having shared her emotional story, painful memories. We pray that you might settle her mind and that you might keep her safe as she travels back home tonight. Thank you for this time together, and we pray that you might continue to bless our conversations as they carry on. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Just to say goodbye to you on the live stream. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you in person sometime soon. You don't have to disappear off anywhere. You can stay behind. There'll be some music on in the background, more coffee and tea and cakes. Thank you for joining us tonight.